Hello and welcome to the latest in the Somerford Associates series of podcasts where we discuss issues of contemporary technology interest with a variety of technology leaders, primarily those that are associated or with partners of Somerford Associates. And one of our prominent partners and most important partners is Confluent, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Peter Pugh-Jones, the EMEA Chief Data Officer for Confluent. Peter, a very warm welcome.
Thank you, John, and thank you for saying most important. Always excellent. Yes, Pete Pugh-Jones, Field CDO at Confluent, I should stress. Yes, our team is called that because we want to help customers understand that our history, our legacy is in Confluent is about working with infrastructure and technologies and helping people get that right. Whereas our team is a little bit skewed or more skewed towards what they do with the data and how to get the most out of it. So hopefully that explains the CDO title.
And of course, from our perspective, up until fairly recently, it was just us and Confluent. But now, of course, there's been a fairly hefty acquisition by IBM.
Absolutely. So a few months ago, we became Confluent, an IBM company, and part of the logic, we can talk about it a bit more as we go along, but part of the logic behind that was our background in helping customers bring together event-driven architecture technologies that are very complex and difficult to use in a space that makes it easier for them to focus on their specialty, which is the data. And in IBM's case, they could see that would fill a great role for them in the space of AI into the future. We play quite an important role in many AI-based architectures today, and many customers may even use Confluent and Kafka, which is the underlying streaming technology for event-driven architecture that we look after.
For me, I always think when I think about Confluent or Kafka, I think it's one of those technologies that people touch every day in their lives without necessarily realizing it, isn't it?
That's very true. So if you think about both the open source capability and our own, whether it's us or not, there's many of the things on your phone, for example, the apps that you might have today, you will be utilizing something like Kafka or Confluent, depending on which one is embedded, to help you do all sorts of things, such as order cabs. Uber have Kafka embedded in their capability, and it's the thing that helps, with the events being updated of where the taxi is and which kind of taxi you wanted, and understands what your kind of consumer you are for that service, just as much as you might be using some order service to have food delivered, or perhaps you're trying to coordinate things to do with flights that you have, go through airports. So pretty much everything you do that requires instant updates is an event-driven architecture underneath, and Kafka would be part of it.
And so the thing about when we were talking about earlier about AI readiness and AI adoption, massive push for organizations to accelerate this process. But you argue, of course, that AI is and the LLMs are only as good as the data through which they're sort of extracting the responses, if you like. And what does that look like in a normal enterprise in terms of their ability to and their readiness for this acceleration of AI adoption?
So hopefully not too long an answer for that, but if you go over the last sort of 20, 25 years, before the current surge of artificial intelligence and large language models and agentic AI, all the sort of buzzwords of today, many companies, many businesses have had some implementation in production live for analytics or AI in some shape or form. So machine learning models, deep learning models, neural network type implementations that can help them do many things operationally. And they've been working with that space for a long time. And even that long into the journey, where they've built the models themselves, they've made them operational, they're trying to connect and flow data through them to get better insights quicker, even in that scenario, something like 70% of models still don't really get into production, right? Because of a fundamental challenge that they have. So this is established AI techniques we're talking about. And the fundamental challenge is all of the silos of data that they're trying to gather the information from being fed into it in a way that makes it efficient and return on the investment worthwhile. So if we then take that state of affairs, which is today, And then we add on all of this amazing stuff people are trying to do at the cutting edge of AI with the LLMs, large language models, and agentic based usage of AI. You can see that that's just going to get worse, right? Effectively, it scales because we're talking about much more data, many more decisions, many more agents helping make those decisions. And the complexity for all of that could lead to some challenges for people if they haven't engineered the data correctly in the first place.
Because is this where, and I've heard you talk about this, data hallucination comes from?
Yeah, so the hallucination is quite a complicated subject, and those folks who work in the world of data science will explain it probably a little bit more lucidly than I might. I have done work in the data science space, but I think the way I try to explain it is if you give someone some information, even let's say a youngster, a child perhaps, just learning the world today, and you give them some information and they make a decision on that information, or they come up with a way to solve something, but they've only been given a bit of information. They haven't got the latest information. They haven't got the right information.
Yeah.
Perhaps where they've been getting information from is not the most accurate. And they'll make a decision to do something based on that data. So that's an incomplete set of information. And it might actually be what we think of as a hallucinated decision, if you like. They've come up with a way to solve a problem which it doesn't work. And I'm trying to think of an analogy that could work for that, and I can't think of one. Perhaps it would be, akin to an AI recommending you spend 10 minutes underwater swimming to see the coral without realizing that you actually have to breathe, right? So, for example, that could be a sort of example of hallucination, right?
Yeah.
So,
I see. And so, I mean, are organizations genuinely unprepared for this sort of AI readiness as perhaps you, or is this just sort of vendor hype who are, in the same way that perhaps they're trying to sort of essentially exaggerate the challenge or the problem?
Well, so I think that there's two elements to that. Obviously, you've got the drive from some of the cutting edge companies of the world wanting to make people take advantage of AI and all the wonderful things. And I'm an optimist for AI, by the way. I genuinely believe it can be a good thing, and as long as it's used correctly, will be a good thing for the human race. But there is a sort of drive to that and getting people to do it more. And then there's the reality of how people go about implementing it. And often what you'll find, I believe, and it's just a general view, and others may not agree, the investment tends to be focused heavily on let's do the AI stuff, and the decisions that are made to put budget out there are for making the AI available and then being able to say, hey, to the investors or the board, hey, we've done AI, look at this, isn't it great? But the reality, of course, is that the investment to make AI efficient and work well and scale for the whole organization in a way that makes a bigger difference is that you've got to invest on what the supply of information is, if you like, the blood for that, right? And that's really the data. And if you haven't sorted that out first, especially on very complex legacy systems where you've got many different ways of feeding data around your organization, I think you really can start to have problems with the return on the investment on those scenarios. So you'll spend a lot of money on the AI piece and forget that actually you've got to do something else first. Another analogy might be you've got to fix your plumbing before you turn on the tap, right? So that is a very simplistic way of thinking about it, but that could be it.
Very appropriate, certainly at our age anyway, Pete. Is that, that thing about, and you mentioned that about boards and their sort of that accelerant to adopt all of this. I mean, what's the biggest sort of misconception that the boards have about this process, do you think?
Well, I mean, it might be a little unfair for me to sort of say it's a complete misconception. I think people are realistic about things, but perhaps it's driven by what folks believe is their own experience of it in their day-to-day lives, right? So, we talked about apps and things that you might use on a daily basis, get instantaneous updates, and they feel useful. So you think that you're getting value from what you know is running underneath the hood there. I will say it's not always AI that's giving you that insights. It's giving you that enrichment. You can do quite clever things in streaming data, especially if you have what we call current context, which means all the different possibilities of communication somebody has with a business loaded somewhere in a stateful way so that you can then output the results more efficiently for something to use, right? In other words, if I ring somebody up, I have an email exchange with them over a period of time, I send them text messages, all of those channels being joined together with the latest set of information available to an entire organization to be able to reap the rewards from. That's the sort of the kind of benefits you can get from it. But if you don't think about those things properly, you'll end up with the mess we've already kind of discussed, right? And I think this is where often the budget is for the AI, and it's not given to what is probably considered a slightly more boring subject, which is the data part. Where's the data? How's the data working? Is it enriched correctly? Is there a good set of storage information? Do we know the metadata for this? Do we know the origins of this? We've got 6 different databases. We've got these other systems that feed those systems. Multiple versions of the truth all over the place, perhaps, right? And it's those things that maybe create the confusion. So at small scale, if little projects that people do, like pilots and things, you can prove it out very, very successfully. It's when you try and scale it and make it operational across a whole organization that you have a problem, because you haven't sorted out the plumbing.
Yeah, of course, and you risk exacerbating and reinforcing
absolutely
the challenges on a macro scale.
Yes, I think so. Yes.
So, Pete, do you think we're at risk of repeating the same mistakes we made during the sort of early cloud transformation era in terms of buying the vision before fixing the foundations?
I think there is a danger of that, and I think it does make sense. Again, it's a little unfair because there's so many different kinds of companies, and some of them have much longer histories than others, right? So there is a danger of it, because I think it's easy to attach some effort to the new shiny thing, but you've got to make the new shiny thing useful, and that's really what we're talking about here. And I think sometimes you have to go back and not only re-architect the way that your data systems flow and store and work with data and so forth, but also maybe change some thought process people have about how they work with data. I mean, the most common thing I come across, and loads of people will, I'm sure, agree with me on this one, is that many sort of chief architects and others in all sorts of businesses around the different industries I've worked will often say, well, this is a batch-based process. It works fine. I don't need to change it. It doesn't need to be real time. Is often the phrase people will say, and actually we're not. In my mind, we're not talking about real time. We're talking about fundamentally redesigning the way systems work to make them more future-proof into the future. So if you simply leave those things that are batch-based and let them run because they're fine and you don't need to change them, yes, that might be okay. But the real value that you get is when you bring all of your architectures together in a fundamentally new way, change your mindset. And I remember one of my mentors in the streaming space once said to me, Pete, it's a very simple paradigm, right? In most of the sort of history of computing, we take data, we load it somewhere, we put it there, we put it into shape in that sort of storage at rest place, and then we start analyzing it. Then we start playing with it. So we build the analysis on top of what we've gathered, right? Whereas in the streaming paradigm, we sort of create the analysis we want to do, we lift it into memory, we stick it in memory, and then we turn on the taps and flow the data through it. It's a completely different way of thinking. And if you don't think that way, you can't really understand the overall benefit you can get across your architecture. So often with customers, we'll say to them, imagine, certainly the folks who are responsible for maybe risk or sort of return on the investments of the technology, things that they need to build. We try to give them this sort of come to this meeting, come to this workshop with no handcuffs of basically what technology-wise you have, and instead think about the data that is in your organization. Imagine what you would do with all that data is there. If you could do anything at all, what would you do first? What would be the most exciting thing that you might do? And it often creates a really completely different set of conversations with customers who think more innovatively as a result. And then we go back and figure out, okay, now what would we have to do with the technology to make that happen? And invariably, it is about bringing together systems in a streaming paradigm to help resolve those things that they want to do.
But of course, it does depend on the quality of the data, though, doesn't it? I mean, why do organizations, do you think, repeatedly underestimate the quality of their data in this process? Because, of course, when you're interrogating any, garbage in, garbage out, essentially, isn't it?
Well, I think it is. It might be something to do with the way companies have sort of evolve, right? So you tend to have, and this again is a very sort of broad painting of a picture, but you tend to have a scenario where somebody in charge of something it has a view that's maybe slightly different from the reality. And I often see this where I'll go into a meeting with a senior person in the company, C-level perhaps, And they'll say, well, actually, our data's all excellent. And look, I've got all these reports that help me see this information. It's not maybe as up to date as I'd like it, but that might be the kind of phrase they use. And they go, but go and meet my team who produced this for me, and you'll see what I mean. And then you go talk to that team, and they're in a private conversation, they'll tell you that in order for that data to get that excellent, they've had to do a massive amount of wrangling of that data, a massive amount of changes to it, transformations to it, to make it actually look the way that it needs to look, which is a huge overhead. And the actual source itself is often quite, or the sources themselves are often quite messy and dirty and swampy. And I think that is often the answer I get. I mean, I mentioned to you before.
Yes, absolutely. I was going to.
In my early career, where I was working on a system that used to be called Artemis. It was a database system used in engineering projects, and we had this huge
Artemis. That's very contemporary.
Yeah. It's it was made by a company called Metier. I don't know if it even exists anymore. And this was a very long time ago. So my apologies for those of you who probably weren't even around at that point. But it was a system where you would write loads of code, and that code would build you the project plan, and you'd have resources mapped against activities, just like you might do in any project planning. But it was for thousands and thousands, and even potentially millions of activities, to do with shutdown of a offshore oil refinery, or whatever you call those things, platform, right? And that system would take ages to get the chart out of it, right? So you would spend days and days working on something. You produce this output to show somebody who was going to go report to their customer how we were doing on whatever the project was we were doing. And one example was this envelope chart. We used to I think it was called an envelope chart. And you had two lines, one at the top, one at the bottom, that would sort of be like this. And those lines would say, this is what it should cost where you are at the moment in the project, and this is the number of resources you need, perhaps down the bottom there. And then the line of the reality was in between, and it would be, it should be in the middle, right? If you're on target for where you're going, it should be in the middle. And I always remember I took this to the chap who was leading the effort, and I won't say which company it was, so I don't want to put anybody into trouble. And they were going to take this to the customer and show them this report. And the line in the middle wasn't in the middle. It was way over where it should have been. It was on the other side of the envelope. It was basically, we were running a huge cost on this thing. And the guy didn't like it, obviously. He didn't want to have to go and have that conversation. So he took his something called Tipex, which many people might not know what that is, but it's a little white link thing. And he Tipexed out this red line, which had taken me ages to produce. And then he drew a different line with his pen. He photocopied it, so it was black and white. And he took that
and
to his meeting.
Looked better. Presentation a little better.
And that's a very extreme example of massaging the data to make it look right for somebody else to consume. And I think there's a lot of work that goes on in that space underneath. And I'm being really mean there. Most people, of course, won't falsify the data, but there's a lot of tuning that has to happen. And sometimes that tuning might lead to people believing the data is better than it is.
Yes.
Very long explanation. So
Not at all. Not at all. So what about tech debt? I mean, it's a legacy tech, and we sort of hear that phrase sort of bandied around quite a lot. And I wonder, at what point does tech debt become AI debt?
Right. That's a fascinating question, actually. And I don't know if we've yet to see exactly at what point that takes place, but perhaps it's somewhere in that ground where people are feeding data to their, let's call them agents. And just to describe the way I describe agents, because it seems the easiest way to do it is these are pieces of code which are specialized in a job. So that would be the easiest one to think about is a travel agent, right? So in the old days, when I wanted to book a holiday somewhere, I'd go to a travel agent and I'd sit at a desk and they would look up through, if they had a computer, or brochures, and they'd pick for me. They're specialized. They would know based on what I told them what kind of holiday I'd want. Well, that's what an agent is in the AI world. You have an agent that's specialized in different things, and that would have been a travel agent. There would be one who's specialized in finance. There might be another one who's specialized in legal things, right? And if you use those correctly, and if you feed them the right kind of information for their specialization, then they can collaborate together and then use large language models to come up with a better outcome, right? But if you build all that architecture incorrectly, they don't communicate very well, especially if the data you're feeding them is not good, then they're going to end up it's going to be chaos. And you could end up potentially being advised in the wrong direction as a result. So I think that's where we could see some sort of debt coming from it, because people might have to go back and reverse engineer things, because all they've done is fix the endpoint. They've done something at the end for AI, but they haven't fixed the underlying data architectures. Once again, it's the same problem. The technical debt creates more potential for having to revisit what you've done in the future and perhaps spend a lot of money fixing it.
Yeah, of course. I was reading an article you wrote a few weeks ago, and in it you talked about fragmented systems and disconnected data. And I just wondered from that, is the real problem tech or organisational silos and politics?
Yes, it's a fascinating question. I think there's two ways I would cover that, right? So number one, I think there is a problem with the tech because people tend to stick with what works, and they don't want to have to rebuild something or replace something that at least is returning value, they think, at some level. So that's one area. But then you've also got that political element where someone somewhere has sponsored that thing being put in place or sponsoring it existing within the architecture of the system. So there is that politics where I've been to meetings where I can see a customer, two different teams in a customer, or even three different teams arguing about the right way to do something. And of course, they're always trying to do what's right for their business, but most of them will have some kind of stake in the technology that they want to use. Yeah. And that's often what I think, if you grow that, if you scale that up, overall tends to be the challenge. I mean, I've got real world experience of it. A bank that I use, my dad and I have the same name, and for the last 5 years we've been able to see each other's credit cards. And that's an example when they absorbed that credit card company into their business. They couldn't differentiate between us because we both have the same name. Someone did something wrong in that code, and even today they can't unpick it. That's an example, right? And they've done something with the engineering of the data, which is almost impossible for them to fix without having to go all the way back through and probably spend a fortune doing it just to fix that one problem.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. So a real sort of personal impact.
Real personal impact. It's only my dad, so we don't mind seeing each other's data, but still, okay.
It could, yeah, I know. It could go horribly wrong. Okay. And again, I mean, you talked about that sort of AI failure rate as well being quite high, and I just wonder, is that a leadership problem rather than a tech one then?
It could be. It could be related to the silo thing that we've touched on, because if you don't have someone who's overall in charge of how you're going to bring together the data from the various different departments or business units, or however you describe your organization, in a way that has the vision for how AI should be applied across the whole org holistically, I think that's probably what's missing from it in many companies, right? So there's someone who has the power to say, hey, yes, I can see you're each of you doing these things separately in siloed ways, but actually that's costing us, if there's three departments, that's costing us 3 times what it might have cost if we just approached it in a more holistic way and implemented our regulatory requirements and responsibilities collectively in the center of it, which could be, in my mind, in the string, right? Which would make sense in reusable objects.
Yeah, of course. Do you think the sort of AI adoption then is going to widen the gap between well-run and badly run companies, perhaps faster than any previous technology shift has done? I
think it could, and although badly run might be an unfair phrase.
I mean, it's
but it because of circumstances and history, it may produce this kind of vision of badly run, but actually it's just the complexity of what they're trying to deal with. The best example of that is fintech startups, any kind of new business who has none of that baggage that they have to bring with them, and they can pick up the latest thing and even use it. In fact, I've seen some companies do that. So some of the big banks in the world have created new entities that are effectively not using the legacy systems. They're using new systems, and those are more like a fintech. They have access to the older systems if they want them, but it helps them move quicker if they want to. I think a good example of that might be Chase UK, for example.
Right. Okay. Because that sort of, I guess there's an inherent sort of agility required and responsiveness required, and because of the mindset, they're able to sort of turn it around fairly quickly.
Yeah, because they haven't got to go, what about these other 20 systems that exist?
Of course, yeah, of course. And what about if AI quality is bad, does AI actually amplify organizational dysfunction then?
So that's another one I think that we will probably have to observe over time. So I think we might start to see it fairly soon, where there will be, especially in the customer experience space, which I think some of it is a little bit further ahead. So where you see consumers complaining about the lack of maybe response or the correct responses from chatbots or systems that they've been talking to, you'll start to see maybe that was probably created in some slightly dysfunctional way underneath. So it's kind of the analogy of a hey, my car's all very shiny and brand new looking, but underneath it, I've got bits of bicycles and duct tape sticking it all together, right? And that's the analogy, I think.
Yeah, no, I see, absolutely. And then of course, it's what we'd like to do is to sort of look out a bit and offer up pearls of wisdom to ideally to any CIO or CISO who might be listening to this and assessing whether their organisation was AI ready. What are the first three things you think that they should examine before they sort of proceed?
If I was going to say three things, the first one might be the regulatory pressure. So if there's someone who's affected by regulation, and let's be honest, everyone is in some way, because it's usually about customer data. So GDPR at minimum is there. There's also the AI Act that's there. I think the first thing they need to do is decompose what the regulators have given them, individual things that they've given them to look at, and understand the logic behind those questions, the regulations that, or whatever it is they're trying to align with, and make sure that even the regulator has thought about the question correctly, because it could well be that those regulations were crafted in a way in a time that wasn't relevant to today. And actually, what I found with many customers in the past is they'll have a blanket set of tick boxes you have to check, and they won't go in and say, why are we having to check that checkbox? What's the driver behind that? And actually ask the question, because it could be that there's a way to meet that requirement, but with newer methodologies, newer techniques, especially streaming related ones, where you can obscure data in different ways and make it available to people in a more secure way and so on. So I think that's the first one. And the second one would be, what's my cloud policy? What am I doing with cloud? How have we understood it in the business? Are we utilizing it the right way? Do we need to have hybrid? And many customers started with let's just do everything in the cloud, especially in the banking space. But I would say that many of them are now thinking about that again, reevaluating it and saying, well, maybe we need to do some things in a sort of on-prem kind of way, or in an environment we own, and some things in the cloud. So we need some kind of shared metadata between them, and we need companies that can help support that method. We obviously do that. That's one of the things we help people with.
Okay.
And then the last one is really budget. Where's the budget allocated? Is it properly allocated across the board to help solve the underlying challenges, or is it just about the new shiny AI thing?
Yeah, I mean, I can see, and I'm certainly the current climate. That's probably where there might be some of the most challenges, unless of course you could represent or demonstrate the impact on resources in terms of cost saving measures and all the rest of it.
Yes, I mean, I think where a lot of companies start right, and many of them start. I've always said, start with something small. If you want to experiment with being successful with some new technologies of any kind, but AI in particular, start small for sure. Pick the data problem, or pick the data will help you solve the problem. Utilize that and engineer that in as a pilot or something with your AI. Demonstrate it working that way, so you can help get the budget. But while you're doing that, don't forget that engineering piece you did with the data to make it work in the pilot is going to be a very different proposition when you're trying to scale it for your whole business, especially if you're like 300,000 people working in a company. You've got to figure out how to get what that it's doing at scale for everyone to make the benefit from it.
It's interesting as well, you mentioned regulatory pressure, because there is an argument, I mean, it depends on which part of the world you're in, of course, that regulatory systems aren't always keeping up with AI adoption. So there's a bit of a fine sort of path to be trodden, isn't there, for organisations, and their understanding of what they should and shouldn't be doing and what best practice looks like.
Yes, I mean, I think that can be a real challenge. I completely sympathise with, especially big organisations that have a minefield of things to navigate. But in the end, I think it is about having better conversations with the regulator about what they need to do, what their vision is for the future. Some of the regulators are very advanced in that thinking. I mean, I don't know about all of the central banks, but certainly the Bank of England is very ahead of the curve in some of the things it does with, for example, its new system it launched last year, real-time gross settlement. It's like $1 trillion a day continuously being settled through that system. And that is an event-based architecture with lots of other things plugged in. And it demonstrates that the regulators are thinking about the future and how they're going to be able to serve AI in the long term.
And what about in the other public sector? Are there any other good examples in the public sector where that's working?
So in the security space, for sure, sort of Homeland Security, Ministry of Defense, I've seen some really exciting, what I'm allowed to know about them anyway, projects within reason. But for sure, the application is quite extreme. There's some very clever ways of working with data to get the best out of it for the benefit of the nation or the benefit of people, but also perhaps keeping folks safe, right? I mean, I think that's one of the primary benefits of it. But even within taxes, you can see some really innovative ways of working, not always in my favorite zone, and just the same with everybody. But of course, if it helps in some way, make sure that people are paying the right taxes in the right ways, I think that's always a good thing, right? So.
Yeah, of course. And what about metrics associated with AI readiness? Which ones would you suggest? I mean, where do they sit? Which ones are really useful, and which ones are meaningless?
Well, so I think this is an area that's always been fascinating in business because, people who do statistics will often say, well, in fact, there's a BBC have got a show about where they unpack statistical things that are announced in the press. So I think I can't remember the name of that show, but it's really good because it helps validate things. You can, if you want to, you can slice and dice data in any way you like to show the results you want, right? And this is something we see in politics all the time, right? And so what I think with analysis of success, what I really think companies need to do is actually properly evaluate the outcome of the intended customer, right? Whoever it was who was receiving that result, were they getting a better experience after than they had before? And is the return on the investment better as a result than it was before? And I think those are the ones they should really be looking at. Often people will measure success in small silos, and of course for them it looks great. Hey, look at this. I've spent less money on this platform this year than I spent last year, but nobody knows that somebody else had to spend a load more money on loads of people to maintain it in the background, right? Which is obviously on a different level of the balance sheet.
Well, and interestingly as well, we've seen a fair amount of evidence of the data manipulation in the last few days with the results of elections and stuff like that by all parties. So no one specific.
No, they're all good at it.
They are, aren't they? Of course. And then what do you think? What do you think the balance then is between fixing data first and learn by deploying AI now?
That is an area I think that really is the crux of the problem, because I think a lot of businesses don't realize that you have to spend more money on working on the data first before you can really get the best value that you're going to get out of AI. But I think in order for that to happen, they need to adjust that graphic equalizer, using old speak there, right?
Oh, right. Yes, I remember that.
The sound adjustment, right? They have to, they maybe need to turn down the investment on the AI side, right, to maybe one or two really specific things they want to do as a value, and improve the amount of spend on the data side. I think it, especially at the beginning, right? At the beginning, you get that bit right once, and then start getting all of the things that supply the data into it correct continuously. Then you can start to spend more on the AI as you build confidence that what you're doing and how it's working works really well. So I think it's that. You've just got to adjust it so you have more of a spend on the data side first.
And for those organizations then with, we've sort of touched on this, I think, several times, but with years of legacy infrastructure, where should they realistically start?
Go back to a pain point, right? And we always talk about this in technology, but actually it really does matter. Don't just say I need some AI and let's AI up on everything, right? Instead, maybe go, what is it that we're doing right now that causes us the absolute most pain? Not necessarily even the most spend, but the most length of time, the most complicated thing that you have in your business. And it could be that you have somewhere in the business a batch-based system where maybe a partner or another company sends you files on a regular basis, and you need to then go and tidy up those files. You need to do stuff with them before you can then add them to your own data and then enrich it and make some sense of it. Or it could be that you've just got a system that is very old that you're trying to modernize. And actually, I've got an example of that. So in the airline industry, there's something like 360 companies that work together collaboratively with a business called IATA or IATA. And they talk about using a messaging system in that environment, which goes back to the 50s, called TTY, teletype, right? And nearly every message through that whole organization is sent through teletype messages. And that business is responsible for a massive amount of revenue between those organizations. When you buy a ticket that's on multiple airlines to go through all those different partners, there's a load of money that exchanges hands through all the different systems, and that it goes through this one system. So there's an example where they have an aspiration to modernize that. The CIO has talked about that, I think publicly at their event in Singapore recently. And if they can turn that into an event-based architecture, they're really making themselves ready for the future. They're really future-proofing. Whereas if they only sort of put lipstick on that, they're not ever going to really fix the underlying challenge of that old system that is creaking underneath. It doesn't really work with modern technologies that well.
And then what about data cleaning exercises? I mean, again, we've sort of discussed this, where the outputs are only as good as the data that it's recovering from the systems. But how do you avoid those endless data cleaning exercises that never seem to produce any business value?
Well, so I think it goes back to one of the first questions we discussed, which is changing our mindset fundamentally with how we work with the data. So rather than putting in place a batch-based flow, a stream of ETL or ELT, some people refer to it depending on what you're doing, but doing that in a sort of, okay, here's my data over here, there's 5 sources, I'm going to pick it up once a week and I'm going to flow it through this process and I'm going to put it over here, and then once a month I can analyze that data, or however you work. Instead, take that analysis, take that transformation you're doing, stick it in a stream, turn on the taps and have the data continuously flowing through it. Rather than the words real time, talk about it as continuous and have it continuously being transformed and continuously available for everybody to consume from in a way that's secure and encrypted if needed, with the right fields made available to everybody, with the right metadata set up for everyone to understand what they're looking at and have confidence in that data. And you suddenly remove a massive amount of overhead and older systems as a result.
Right, okay. It's safe to say, I mean, you are a bit of a data visionary, I would say. So I'm going to ask, in 5 years from now, if you were to sort of predict the future then, what's going to separate those organisations that have succeeded with AI from those that perhaps have wasted millions or have not succeeded then?
I think it is going to be about those that are able to understand the importance of bringing together systems of data in a way that future-proofs them for the usage of AI. I think it is about that. I think it's really vital. The companies, if you look at the larger ones that have been around longer, I think those companies need to think about, and many of them are appointing someone who's actually in a role that has that responsibility, sort of a CIA. That would be a terrible name.
Yeah.
But someone who's, I actually got that run the wrong way anyway. CAI, wouldn't it? Okay, but that would be someone maybe with overall responsibility for ensuring that the data sources across the organization are correctly being evolved to work with the future of artificial intelligence. And I think that would be a really key role, and that's someone who would work with the CTO and the CIOs of various companies to make sure that they get the information correct. And I think and the plan correct for the future. I think that's the important bit. I think the ones that will be less successful are the ones that aren't able to bring together. Some of the hugest companies we work with, really struggle to bring together a sort of alignment across their different business units. And in some cases, people will say things like, well, actually, I need to keep the vision separate for these different departments. But I would say we'll reevaluate that because, yes, of course, there's always going to be something that if it's a bank, the investment bank needs to do that's different from the corporate bank needs to do, which is different from the retail part of the bank. But there's also something in common between them all, either with the way they work or some of the data is in common. Bring that commonality together. It's going to give you the better context to feed the AI of the future.
I mean, again, I suspect I know the answer to this, but what's one uncomfortable truth about enterprise AI that nobody really wants to hear?
It probably is the underlying message that I've mentioned or said a few times, which is the investment sometimes I think is on the wrong thing. So, definitely start with the pain points, but give people enough money in the right places to ensure that they're able to implement and be properly successful. And to do that, you have to spend money and have to think back about the data. You have to go back to the sources and think about how that data flows right now and how you need to make it ready for the future. Because if you don't, I think they will be lost. They will be lost. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that concludes the discussion. It's been fascinating, and thank you ever so much for giving up your time. Covered a whole range of contemporary issues relating to AI adoption and enterprise architecture. And I mean, how could I possibly wrap it all up. But otherwise, just to sort of say, I guess from my perspective, it reinforces the I guess the purpose behind IBM's adoption of Confluent, and that you can see the sort of linkages there with enterprise architecture and data streaming. It all absolutely makes sense, and I hope the audience will be in the same space as well. So thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much.
Really
John.
grateful.
Thank you.